All right, we'll just give it another minute, and then once it hits 10:05, then we'll start up. All right. So let's get started. Hi, my name is Legna. It's very nice to meet you guys. I am a intern here for Simply Neuroscience, along with another intern here, Sophie. And we're just here to get these slides started for you. One thing about, neuroscience is it's really interesting, and there's definitely like so much to see about it. One thing really quick is there will be a link to one of the papers in chat, as well as a link to the notes on paper in chat made by one of the volunteers from the awareness team. And without further ado, as I do that, Sophie, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay, good morning and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Sophie Audu, and I'm a current intern for Simply Neuroscience under the Youth Mental Health Academy. So we're going to be leading today's July Synapse Session. I'm really excited to talk about, neuroscience in general. And for today's topic, we'll be talking about OCD. So I'm really excited to just, talk with other people who share the same interests with me. And it's nice to meet you all.
Okay. As of right now, Danielle is currently a little busy, but she'll be joining us in a moment.
Hi, my name is Danielle. I currently serve as one of the co-directors of Awareness. Essentially, our mission is to raise awareness about mental health and neurological disorders while simultaneously reducing stigma. And so a huge thank you to Legna and Sophie for the design of these slides. They're also currently interning at an organization called the Youth Mental Health Academy. And without further ado, I think we can get started. So as a mini icebreaker, we have a Menti poll. Sophie is going to put in the chat the link to the Menti, but essentially once you go to menti.com with the code 4906 7139, you'll be able to input your answer to this interactive question. So you might have to go into a different tab, but the code is 49067139. I guess while we're waiting for some responses, Uma, do you want to take a stab at the question?
Absolutely. I'm gonna maybe take myself back to before I was in this field doing anything, and I was just interested because, spoiler alert, I'm mentally ill. And to me, I think the neuro part of neuropsychiatric makes me think of brains, which is very helpful, especially in the context of stigma when we think of mental illness and how it's portrayed in the media. Um, the psychiatric part makes me think of brains and medications versus maybe the false dichotomy of the mind. And as we'll talk about today, like those are two sides of the same coin. And perhaps there's a better way of encapsulating the full human experience than just psychiatric. But that being said, I do appreciate the brain focus. And then the disorder part, I think, is the most important part because to me, that that makes me think of dysfunction. And I love what I'm seeing here: stigma, disabilities, general, suffering and struggle. And that part's extremely important. Wow, I love all the answers I'm seeing here um, because it's so, as we'll talk about, so many disorders are attributed as personality traits or quirks or some sort of superpower. And the literal definition of a disorder is that it's a problem and something can't be great and a problem at the same time. So, yeah, I think everyone else's answers are really spot on.
I think these are all really great answers. And next we'll be moving on to our introduction, so I'll pass the microphone to Legna.
So, welcome everybody to our July Synapse Session. This month's topic will be about, neuropsychiatric disorders, which is an important area of neuroscience that explores how changes in the brain can affect emotions, thoughts, and behavior. Today we're going to be learning about current research, the challenges people have with these conditions, and how neuroscience is helping improve our understanding and treatment of disorders such as OCD, depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. Our goal is to make this complex topic easier to understand while also highlighting the impact that neuroscience has on improving lives.
Okay, so before we get started, we have some expectations we would like you guys to keep in mind. So we ask that you all please be respectful to presenters and attendees throughout the meeting. We kindly ask that you keep your microphone muted, and questions will also be asked during the Q&A session or type in the chat. So let's try and keep the questions to the end. And we also encourage participants to have their cameras on to foster engagement, but we understand if you can't turn it on because you have things going on, but we would really love to see all your beautiful faces. So our speaker for today is going to be Uma Chatterjee. We are joined today by an incredible trailblazer in the field of neuropsychiatric disorder research. Uma is an award-winning mental health neuroscientist, science communicator, and lived experience advocate. After earning her undergraduate degree as a non-traditional student and MS in neuroscience at the University of Texas, Dallas, she is currently a PhD candidate and NIH TL1 Predoctoral Fellow in the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Neuroscience Training Program. Working in Dr. Michael Cahill's laboratory, Uma's thesis research utilizes reverse translational approaches to probe the genetic and mechanistic underpinnings of neuropsychiatric disorders, with a primary focus on OCD pathophysiology and additional projects spanning bipolar disorder, MDD, and schizophrenia. Conducting the first OCD protein quantification studies in the human brain, she works from biochemical analysis of post-mortem human tissue to recapitulating sex and region-specific mechanistic findings in mice across behavior, circuit function, synaptic plasticity, and pharmacological rescue. Her ultimate goal is to study and develop novel therapeutic targets for OCD, with a particular interest in precision psychiatry, neuromodulation, and the mechanisms of action-driven visolytic compounds. Above all, her hope is to help lessen unnecessary human suffering. With that being said, I'll hand over the mic to our guest speaker.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Let me get the screen shared, and we're going to cross our fingers that everything goes super smooth this time. Okay. Can you all see my screen? Amazing. And then, out of curiosity, do you still see my screen or do you see something else?
Only your screen.
Okay, so you're seeing my slides. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. Okay. I have to have a timer and make sure I don't talk forever. So, okay. I am so excited to be here with all of you. And first and foremost, I just want to say that the focus on today's Synapse session for OCD means so much to me as a condition that is so incredibly misunderstood and so debilitating, and as you will see, has so much to be learned about and studied and raised awareness for, and yet OCD is just hardly talked about in our field, let alone in the broader world, as anything other than some sort of adjective or quirk, and we'll get all into that. And I also want to really, really thank everyone for their hard work putting this all together, the amazing Simply Neuroscience team. I'm still in awe of the energy and effort that you all put forth, especially at your age. And you really, I've said this before, you guys all give me so much hope, as well as everyone attending here for the future. So to briefly introduce myself before I get into the whole thing, My name is Uma Chatterjee, and you'll hear far more about why I'm here and what I do. But I will be speaking loosely through a paper that came out in the past year called Biological Mechanisms in Treatment of Obsessive Compulsive Disorder by one of the absolute giants in the field of OCD research and treatment, Dr. Christopher Pittenger, who is a dear mentor and just amazing human being. I was with him just last week at a conference, and I I'm so excited to talk through his synthesis of the current state of OCD research and neurobiology. And this paper is a review. So I think it's really cool because he's also someone who's, largely published or has been one of the biggest publishers of OCD research, period. So he's talking through his own work. Other people's work is very nuanced and critical of different interpretations of things. And I highly recommend people read this paper because it is, for a scientific paper and review, quite accessible. But that being said, something that's very important to me is making things as accessible and understandable as possible to all audiences. So I am so curious later to see how many people here are in the field and are, doing this work and are neuroscientists and want to hear things more through the jargon and through the ways we communicate versus the people who are here who are on the opposite side of the spectrum, who are with lived experience, who are oftentimes intimidated by research and don't really understand when scientists are communicating. And I want you to know that this presentation is going to be geared toward you. So scientists, if I'm going too slow, just know that that's why, because it's really important to me to make this accessible for everyone. So with all of that being said, it's really important for me to start off with who I am and why I do this and really frame this conversation. So you heard the really generous introduction of me. This is sort of a picture collation of where I am today as a human being. It's hard to encapsulate all of it, but I am a third-year PhD candidate in neuroscience. I have earned multiple grants and fellowship awards. I recently was awarded the NIH Outstanding Neuroscience Scholar Award just like last week, which is so wild to me. I extensively present on OCD research. I am a science communicator. I'm an advocate. I forgot to put my podcast logo on here, but I host a podcast called A Chat with Uma. I just share my story and my research extensively, but far more important than that, I am someone who has purpose and a reason to live today. And I am functional. I'm functional and I'm doing things and I'm able to exist in this world. And I'm also a wife. I'm also a dog mom. And this is me and Chris at our presentation last week, so it felt fun to put in there. And that's all well and good. And that's who you're seeing today. What's really important to know, though, is where I came from and who I was, relative to where I am today just a few years ago. I was born with many severe, debilitating mental illnesses. Some of the highlights from the highlight reel are clinically extreme OCD, which my clinicians and I deemed to be onset from the time I was born. And I had symptoms as early as like 3 years old that took over my whole life. I developed treatment-resistant depression very early on, PTSD and chronic PTSD, complex PTSD from at least age 7, eating disorder with bulimia, panic disorder, anxiety, ADHD, so many things. Like, honestly, how many letters can I collect from the DSM, which we'll get into more so, like the discrete diagnoses versus how our brains work and how they parlay into different symptom presentations. But all that said, to sum it up, I was born really, really ill. And that coalesces with many other factors of my identity that I won't get into today, but really do matter. I was, just to summarize it, born into an immigrant household with no access to treatment, a ton of stigma around anything, mental or psychiatric, like not even knowing that was real. So my suffering was really labeled as just being spoiled and not being good enough. And I just needed to get over it. And I didn't even know how to label my suffering. And as you'll get to hear about OCD later, my suffering is not something I would even say out loud because of the fear of consequences. I was in a religious cult. I was also subject to a ton of abuse in my house by immediate and extended family, and all that culminated into me being just an extremely dysfunctional person that ultimately I was, amidst many things, just attempting to end my life like very often. From age 12 onward, I have experienced and survived, luckily, 12 attempts to end my life. I have been institutionalized many times in different levels of care in psychiatric hospitals, and I was incorrectly diagnosed and improperly treated for 25 years, up to turning 25 years old, really, by 22 different clinicians. And we'll get into more about why that it was and how misunderstood and mistreated OCD is. And as it pertains to where I am today and the work I'm doing, as you can imagine, like I was barely hanging on, could not function at all, and attempted college at 18, failed all of my classes and dropped out of college at 20 with a 1.83 GPA, which wasn't even my biggest problem because like I literally couldn't get out of bed or leave my house or do anything other than do the bare minimum to support myself because I was financially independent. And I was just completely dysfunctional, had no hope, and life was absolutely horrible, to say the least. And funnily enough, I guess, I was diagnosed with cancer at 22, and that was sort of the beginning catalyst of things turning around for me because when you're diagnosed with cancer, and I hope no one in the audience knows what this is like, but if you do, then you know that there's a part of you that kicks in survival mode to try to help you get through it. And like, what do I do? How do I get through this? How do I, go through treatment and figure it out? And that part did exist in me. But just to illustrate the level of debilitation that mental illness had on me, there was another part of me that was like, thank goodness, because this will just save me from my suffering because I deserve to die. And I clearly have not succeeded in ending my own life. So maybe this will do it for me. And really contending with that duality just made it like more evident to me than not of the fact that there is something very wrong here, but I also wasn't able to figure it out on my own, nor should I have been figuring it out on my own. And so, honestly, through social media and the internet from 22 to 25, and sort of getting brave enough to start Googling my actual symptoms, which you'll hear about in the next few slides, I finally found my accurate diagnoses, especially and particularly with OCD. And more importantly, then I found accurate evidence-based treatment. And that completely transformed my life. I am not cured of OCD. I am still in treatment 3 times a week. I still am moderate to severe, and my other conditions are pretty loud as well. But the fact that I have a grasp on them and I'm able to function and survive, and I have the tools that I've been able to learn, despite my complex case, to be able to like take back my life and understand and learn how to function in the world and understand my mind and how it works was so utterly transformative that all I could think about with this like new lease on life and the bandwidth I started to have, not just being fully sucked into my mental illness anymore and just like having any other time to think about anything else, it became like, what is going on? Like, what is going on in my brain? Why am I suffering so extensively? And I embarked on, I guess, what I like to call a journey of me search. And so that led me to go back to college as a non-traditional student. Starting at 25, I went back to my same undergrad degree that I had dropped out at 20. I retook all those classes that I had failed, and up my GPA from a 1.83 to like a 3.51. I tried for a 4.0, but there were certain classes that they didn't let me retake. So whatever, good enough. And it was a bachelor's in psychology at the time. And I had taken a neuroscience class because I was required to at my particular university. And I had come from a background of like, my brain was not like there. Like I could not take in information. So I just assumed like I was to insert any like self-deprecating adjective. Like I'm too stupid. I'm incapable. That's for other people, whatever. Like science scared the living crap out of me. I should also add, by the way, we talked about this before the session. I have a potty mouth. I am so sorry. I'm going to try so hard to censor myself for the youngins in this presentation. But if I do slip up, please, I take full responsibility. This is not on Simply Neuroscience. So I said crap instead of what I was going to say. But anyway, I just did not like, I would never have taken a science class on my own, like biology, chemistry, nothing, definitely not neuroscience. But for my psychology degree that I was interested in because of, mental illness, that felt more accessible to me at the time. And then I had to take the neuroscience class, and I had failed it, obviously, the first time I took it. And then, as you can see in this picture, and I then took it again when coming back to school. And as much as I had all my negative self-talk and my OCD and everything just really loud. There's also this other part that was like so fascinated by the fact that I was understanding for the first time the different levels and processes of what's going on in our brain on a fundamental level, but more importantly to me, how that helps to understand mental illness and what's going on. And so my question had always been like, well, what is happening and what can we do to fix it? And suddenly I contended with the realization that neuroscience is the answer to my repeated questions of, but why, but why, but why? Like I was just really annoying in all my psychology classes, asking basically about mechanism without realizing it. And so that was my very unexpected inroad into neuroscience. And I made a decision after undergrad that instead of going to become a therapist, I had gotten into master's and PhD programs for clinical psychology. I decided to not do that. And I went and got my master's in neuroscience instead. I started working in, rather than more psychological human-based labs, I started working in mechanistic wet labs, which we'll talk about, and completely fell in love with the ability to be able to study the brain and study like what's happening specifically as it contributes to mental processes and ultimately the symptoms of mental illness and how we can treat them ultimately. So that is how I got here. And that is super important for me to share in order to frame both how I'm talking about OCD and like the work I'm actually talking about. So to just briefly get into what OCD is and what it's not in order to talk about the science. I am sure you have seen something like this. I see and hear people talking about OCD as an adjective or a quirk like literally 10 times a day. And yes, I have selection bias, but it is so distressing and so painful. And yet it is made so trivialized. It's like, I am so OCD. I have a little bit OCD about people make acronyms. People just make it all about like some sort of trivial, like, oh, you don't like things or you need things to be so perfect or so even. And it's not just not funny. It's also so harmful to people who are losing their lives at 10 times the rate compared to the general population, because not only is it not this, but because of the stigma, because of a lack of understanding, there are such downstream consequences about that. Like we don't get enough funding for OCD research because people don't understand that it's something worth studying. People aren't able to actually get accurate diagnoses like I didn't. We don't get evidence-based treatment because people don't understand what it actually is throughout the entire mental health care system and research system. So all of that to say, if you ever see this, please call it out because it's very harmful. So this is what OCD is not. But in reality, what actually is OCD? It is not a choice. It's not being neat. It's not a quirk or adjective. It's not just overthinking. It's not some sort of joke. Also, it doesn't even make syntactical sense to say, I'm so OCD. Like we said at the beginning, we were talking about what does that word mean to us? To say I am so obsessive compulsive disorder doesn't even make grammatical sense, right? It's like saying I'm so cancer or I'm so PTSD or I'm so anything. And we don't do that, right? Same thing with OCD. OCD is not about liking anything for that matter. It's actually about the most distressing intrusive thoughts, which we'll get into describing in the next slide. But briefly, there's intrusive thoughts. And then there are compulsions, which are physical or mental acts that can look like so many different actions. Like any action you could take mentally or physically could be a compulsion. And ultimately, it involves so many distressful states of being. And it's a cycle that is incredibly difficult to disrupt on its own. So what is real OCD? It involves, according to the DSM, obsessions, which again, it's not like being obsessed with Taylor Swift or being obsessed with pizza. Obsessions in this case are recurrent and persistent thoughts, images, or urges that are experienced as intrusive and unwanted. And they cause unresolvable pathological doubt inside the person suffering, which creates intolerable distress with different states such as fear, anxiety, shame, disgust, and incompleteness. And then those lead to compulsions, which are repetitive mental or physical behaviors that a person feels driven to do in response to the obsession to try to reduce the intolerable stress. They don't want to do these behaviors. Not a single person with OCD wants to be doing a compulsion. We feel like we have to, even if it makes no sense whatsoever, which we'll get to. Like it's basically a faulty association of an intrusive thought that has no merit or value, and our brain's telling us if we do this behavior, it'll go away, although it doesn't go away because it might provide short-term relief, but it then tells our brain that that thought was important in the first place and that behavior mattered, and then we just have to do it again and again and again. And no matter how illogical it is to the person with OCD. Like, if logic cured OCD, I wouldn't have it. I would hope you would think that I have some level of logic or reason as a person doing science. And most people, suffering with OCD loudly or silently, we all have the ability to see that this doesn't make any sense. But there's the other parts of our brain that completely override it. And that level of distress is so painful that we essentially, without tools, like, lose control or choice over the matter. And so that just becomes a vicious cycle that ultimately can take over people's lives. And to be diagnosed with OCD, according to the DSM, this takes over at least 1 hour of your day. So if you have obsessions or compulsions, like, every single human being on this planet has intrusive thoughts. That's been established by research. And everyone occasionally does some sort of behavior that doesn't make sense in response to an obsession. That doesn't mean you have OCD. OCD is when it takes over at least an hour of your day and causes functional impairment and distress in your life. And that's just the beginning of the OCD spectrum of diagnosis. When it takes over an hour, for moderate to severe and clinically extreme OCD, it can get up to 24 hours of your day and you're not sleeping. And for me, that was the case. Like, every waking moment was taken over by OCD. And I'll lastly say that, again, there's so many layers of stigma, but once you get past the part where we don't think OCD is real anymore, or we don't think OCD is a Borger trait, and we do believe it's a disorder, then there's a level of stereotypes where people think OCD is about contamination and it's about cleaning and hand washing, which that is one part, or that's one way OCD shows up for people, but it's actually so much more diverse than that. And there are so many different obsessional themes and types of compulsions people can do. And, I won't read through all of it. I'm sure you guys can learn far more about it on the internet if you're interested, but just what's super important to know is it can look like absolutely anything that someone values. You value relationships, it can attack your relationships. You value being a good person, it attacks your morality. You value, being caring about children, it attacks your sense of, am I a harm to children or not? Like, it truly is so devastating, and especially because of the stigma around taboo parts of OCD. Like, there are tons of themes around harming children, harming animals, harming, for people who would never, ever do that. But our brain just gets latched onto the what if thought, like the thought that any of us have had, all these intrusive thoughts, but people with OCD get latched on. We can't let it go because we're so terrified of it. And then we are doing everything under the sun to try to get rid of that thought, which just fuels the thought even more. So compulsions then look like, very physical ones that you've probably seen stereotypically, but far more commonly are mental compulsions, which is hugely what took over my life. For the most part, I had the physical ones too, but rumination, mental review, thought neutralization, compulsive praying, reassurance seeking, avoidance. It is such a sneaky and pervasive disorder. And oftentimes you can see people living with OCD and you would never know that they're suffering so deeply. So it is so important to study OCD because it affects 2 to 3% of the population, so millions and millions of people. At this time, despite the fact that we do have treatments, which we'll get into, up to 1 in 3 patients don't meaningfully respond to current treatments. And that's only after people actually get those treatments, which is like 2% of people, according to a study that just came out. Like, 2% of people who are diagnosed with OCD even get evidence-based treatment. So that's a whole other problem. But from there, 1 in 3 patients don't respond to the evidence-based treatments we have. So we clearly need to develop better treatments. And we're very behind on that because we don't get research money for it. Like, that graphic over here really sums it up. We get about 6 cents to the dollar for OCD research from the NIH and otherwise, compared to other conditions with similar or lower prevalence and, equal amounts of debilitation. And speaking of debilitation, for how misrepresented OCD is in the media and how much we don't take it seriously, at least the World Health Organization does, and they rank OCD in the top 10 causes of disability worldwide, not just of mental or psychiatric illnesses, of all illnesses. So take that in. Like, it is among the top 10 causes of disability for loss of quality of life and functional impairment and debilitation. And there's a tenfold increased risk of suicide for people in OCD because of how painful the condition is and how hard it is to get accurate treatment. So there are many gaps in fixing the OCD crisis, but the one we'll focus on today in terms of generally the neurobiology of it all is we don't really fully understand the entire the entire picture of the biological mechanisms that give rise to obsessions and compulsions to ultimately develop those precise and biologically driven and effective treatments. But I'm going to share with you what we do know because it's definitely a great starting point. So just from here to orient you to like how I'm going to take you through sort of the highlights of Dr. Pittenger's paper. I always like to start off with like, how are we talking about neuroscience and how are we talking about neuroscience as it pertains specifically to illnesses and understanding it? And there's so many different levels of understanding. We can zoom all the way in to the most granular levels of what's happening in genes, what's happening at the molecular level, and what's happening to cells and the way they communicate and they look and they function. And then what is happening then to those cells as they pertain to comprising of larger brain regions that are then communicating to each other and creating networks and circuits. And then ultimately, how is that driving how people as human beings experience the world and what we describe as symptoms and obsessions and compulsions in this case. And so just this diagram kind of gives us a way to zoom in and out. And that's kind of how I'm going to follow like the levels of analysis in which we're talking about. So the Simply Neuroscience team did an amazing job of synthesizing the core highlights of the paper. So I'm going to have this slide up while I just talk about like some of these points in more detail, and anything else that's not covered is obviously in the paper, but I just felt it was way easier and way more accessible to just talk through them than to like have a figure for every single like point I'm making, because I can oftentimes get, people who don't have a neuroscience background to tune out, and that is far from our goal. So generally speaking, like we talked about, OCD affects a lot more people than we think, and this is just based on the data we have now, and because diagnosis rates are so poor, there's probably far more people with OCD. And when we start with the sort of smallest level of what OCD looks like in the brain and in the body, and like what we call sometimes the causes of OCD, or at least the contributors to OCD, the honest answer to what causes it is we don't know the full answer. And the paper that Dr. Pittenger put out, is really good at providing that nuance from the outset. So I highly encourage you to read it in his words. But we just, as scientists, should never say that we have all the answers. And so that's why I'm telling you, honestly, we don't know. But with that being said, here's what we have found so far. So when we look at the smallest level again with genetics, it is estimated that OCD is heritable at about 40 to 50%, which mostly means that roughly 40 to 50% of the variation in the vulnerability to OCD in people across the population, we're thinking comes from genetic differences. But heritability is often like misunderstood in how we talk about it, because it doesn't mean that 50% of one person's OCD is caused by genes and like the other 50 was caused by the environment, because that's often said, like the diastasis stress model, like genes versus environment, like it's not that. And it also does not mean that there is just one OCD gene, because for most complex brain disorders, especially for this audience, we know that conditions are not usually just like one cause or one thing. OCD, like most psychiatric disorders, is considered a complex or polygenic condition, meaning that there are many genetic variants that contribute to risk. And there are many common variants that generally have very individual tiny effects in someone's brain. And then there's sometimes rarer variants that we found in other papers that have maybe larger effects, but no single variant in genes explains most cases, or like most of OCD for that matter. And a way to like sort of visualize that is when you think of like all these little influences and little like codes that are changing the probability of certain brain systems developing or functioning in particular ways. And notice I didn't say in an OCD way, because we're not just born with an OCD brain. We're just born with a brain that does different things and has different like variants that influence different building blocks and instructions of how our brain works. But ultimately, when it all comes together, there could be like one variant that affects neural development in one way, and another variant affects synaptic communication, the way our cells are talking to each other, and maybe another variant affects or influences how a neuron responds to stress or learning. And altogether, when we look at these individual variants, they tell us very little. But when we put them all together, they help us start to identify the biological processes that are ultimately worth investigating. And so the paper really goes through very well the progress in identifying both the common variants and the rare mutations, while still like making very clear that genetics at this point in time contributes very little to no amount of diagnostic support in terms of assessing to someone of OCD. Like we don't do a genetic test to figure that out because we don't have that information yet. And it's very important to say that genetic studies are very critical to understanding conditions, and OCD, surprise, surprise, has been behind on that because we have not had the funding. But they have been coming out finally in the last few years, like some well-powered studies, and we have been getting that information. And people like me are now taking that information and looking at what is happening in the brain for each of these genes, and what does that mean, and how is that contributing to OCD-relevant symptoms, so we can understand the disorder fully. So then, taking us from genes to more cellular, molecular, and systems level things, these genes all affect different parts of the brain and different things that these brain cells and circuits do. And when we look and zoom out more to the brain regions and the circuitry of it all, one very critical pathway in OCD, which it's called a canonical pathway, meaning that it's a pathway involved in everybody and everything. And it's not just an OCD relevant pathway, but it's called the corticostriatal thalamic cortical, the CSTC loop. I'm not going to keep repeating that because that's a lot of big words. But basically, this pathway involves many different brain regions that are involved in everything from, the cortical parts of your brain, the orbitofrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex. They're involved in decision making, intrusive thoughts in the case of, having these thoughts and not being able to let them go, not being able to figure out, are these thoughts worth engaging with or not? And maybe having an overactive part of that brain. So we're having tons of intrusive thoughts for people with OCD. And those brain regions that are maybe overactive for people with OCD, and being able to identify, is this thought worth engaging with or not, then communicate to deeper parts of the brain, such as the basal ganglia, the dorsal striatum, the caudate, putamen, the ventral striatum, the nucleus accumbens. Those are all words. All that means is that it's more so the motor part of our brain and the reward part of our brain that helps us figure out, when we have these thoughts and we have these, we perceive these things in the world, what are we supposed to do about it? And everyone is supposed to have, a reaction to, if there's a threat, if there is something worth acting upon. That's how we stay alive, right? But imagine if the part of your brain that identifies that is faulty, it's telling the motor part of your brain to do a lot. And people with OCD, when you think about obsessions and then compulsions are actions taken to do something about those thoughts. And so essentially in OCD, it is postulated that the motor part of our brain, there's like a go and a no-go pathway. It's more complicated than that, but to sum it up, there's the part that tells us to take action and the part that tells us to not take action. And in OCD, because of that overactivity, it drives us to take far more action and not be able to stop ourselves from taking those actions pathologically, hence compulsions, which then talks to an even deeper part of our brain called the thalamus that does many things, which governs the way we sort of experience physiological arousal and all the senses of panic and distress and our heart rate going up, feeling sweaty, feeling anxious, feeling all of those things, right? Those are all adaptive because we should feel those things to be able to take action and to recognize that we should take those actions again. But you can imagine if we're already having too many thoughts, we're acting on them too much, and then we're having all those feelings, that's going to code into our brain that we need to do that more, when in reality, we don't need to do that more. And then that's going to tell us back to the cortex, hey, do that again and again and again. And ultimately that circuit is one of the main important starting points for how we understand OCD. It's of course far more complicated because, as we know, or we might know, each brain region I just described talks to not just the next brain region I described, it talks to a bunch of other brain regions. Like, for example, the orbitofrontal cortex talks to the amygdala, right? people oftentimes talk about OCD being an amygdala disorder. That is categorically false. The amygdala is not at all a target in OCD treatment. But for example, if we have an overactive orbitofrontal cortex, it's going to talk to that whole circuit, like I said. It's also going to talk to the amygdala, and for many people, cause the state of anxiety that goes along with that entire circuit. That doesn't mean anxiety is the defining characteristic of people with OCD, but for some people, that is the main emotion they feel with their obsessions and compulsions versus other people, it could be disgust or shame or other things. So I think, and I hope you're hearing it all tied together. Also, I know I am a little bit over time. I will get done so quickly to answer questions, but I just wanted to get through the circuitry, and then that parlays mostly into where we are with treatment today, which if we don't fully understand the disorder, it's really difficult to develop treatments that are biologically precise and that target exactly what's wrong in the brain, right? That being said, what we have so far, the treatments that we have on a biological side in terms of drugs, they mostly target serotonin at this time. And it's important to state that OCD is not conceived to be a serotonin disorder by any stretch of the word. We are using much higher doses of serotonin targeting drugs to change the brain, to change the way the brain is able to respond to treatment, which is like almost like an off target way of getting to the problem rather than just like fixing the problem itself in OCD or the problems. So currently we have those. And again, I keep repeating myself, it's because we haven't had the proper amount of research funding to be able to develop treatments for OCD because we don't understand it. So we're using things from other conditions, and we have not had a single drug to this day that's been developed specifically for OCD. We have, I mean, the paper covers it more extensively, but there are other hypotheses around glutamate, immune systems, and other things that are being explored, but we are nowhere near that, like implementing that clinically yet. Ultimately, we have exposure and response prevention, ERP. That is the first line therapeutic treatment for OCD. Many people, it's life saving. It's what I do, but it also is very difficult to do. And for that, it's very helpful to have drugs that help our brain be able to do such a hard thing. That's where all the drugs come in that may help some people, but ultimately did not actually attack what is happening in our brain. We have been getting more precise developments of treatments like deep brain stimulation and transcranial magnetic stimulation to target the parts of the brain that we are aware are involved in OCD. It's pretty invasive, it's pretty difficult, but it's very life-saving for people. So how can we translate that to more accessible treatments for people is the question. But ultimately, this is just a high-level overview of OCD and where we're at right now, and I will stop rambling so I can get questions, and I can elaborate on anything more in the Q&A as well. Also, there's a spider next to me, and I'm terrified of it, so I'm going to try to do my own ERP right now and be present, but just so you know.
Thanks so much, Uma. I think we're now going to be transitioning into snowball questions, but just for time, I think we're probably only going to do two. Essentially, we're going to be throwing some snowball questions at the audience, so feel free to either type in the chat or unmute yourself, and we hope these questions will deepen your understanding of the selected research article. So please leave any questions at the end for the Q&A, but without further ado, Uma, if you want to advance to like the first question. And then I'll pass it off to Legna to talk more about the question.
All right, so the question below is, how does looking at physical brain structures help us treat mental health conditions like OCD or depression? I'll give that a couple seconds to, simmer in.
Feel free to either unmute or type in the chat.
I feel particularly inclined to this question and can, definitely start rambling my passion in life and my special interest. But I mean, if we kind of what I was saying, like if we are able to understand what the brain looks like, both on a fundamental level, like what brains look like, period, and how they function, as well as what's different in the brains of people with OCD or other conditions, and or in other models like animal models, which we didn't really get into there, but are covered in the paper. We can talk about in the Q&A if anyone's interested. If we can see in a more invasive way what's going on there and going into OCD-like symptoms, we can then develop treatments to target those exact issues. Almost
Yeah,
like
absolutely. Um, The answer that had been written down was that, looking at physical brain structures proves that mental health conditions such as OCD and depression are caused by measurable changes in biological brain circuits rather than a personal weakness. So, by using advanced imaging scans like fMRIs, doctors can pinpoint exactly which areas of the brain are overactive or underactive. And through this knowledge, it allows scientists to create personalized medicine and targeted treatments such as specialized medication or deep brain stimulation that focus directly on correcting those specific problem areas. But yeah, so moving on to the next question.
Okay, the next question is, why is it valuable for a neuroscientist or medical researcher to have personal lived experience with the conditions they study? So feel free to answer in the chat or aloud.
just to share, one example of this in action to sort of reverse engineer an answer from this. This is obviously something I'm very passionate about, given everything I just told you about why I do this work myself. And, when we are studying any condition in the lab, especially when it's on more of the cellular molecular level, and we are using model systems that are not humans, because we aren't able to ethically go into humans' brains and change how their neurons work and put viruses and lights and all these fancy things in there and just like manipulate them and watch their behavior. We are relying on other species to look at relevant behaviors that are, analogous to what humans do. And in the case of, for example, OCD, we're trying in some sense to model any aspect of obsessions and compulsions and things like mice and rats and monkeys and more, which you can imagine is incredibly difficult. But what it does require of a researcher is to understand the human condition deeply to then be able to most effectively develop behavioral paradigms to look at those symptoms accurately. And it is one of the most difficult things to do in our work. And so, just quick example from my work. When we're looking at mice and OCD, for the longest time, researchers have used things like repetitive grooming of an animal or repetitive, burying or repetitive um, just like repetitive actions to model obsessions and compulsions, which are so incomplete. And not only that, they're also the same exact paradigms that are used for to model other conditions or model aspects of other conditions like Tourette's syndrome, like autism spectrum disorder, and more, which they're not the same condition. So it doesn't make sense. And for me, as someone with lived experience, I understand that deeply, and I am not okay with that being our standard. And I'm working in my lab to develop novel behavioral paradigms that can at least more closely both first essentially cause the animal distress to model some aspect of obsessions and then watch their behaviors repetitively after to be closer to compulsive like rather than just be repetitive like. And that comes from me having my own lived experience, which does not in any way take away from my ability to do science. It just gives me insight and firsthand experience to develop novel ways of approaching this condition. I'm so curious to see what you guys have been saying too.
Thank you for that response. But just to add on, so we said personal insight allows researchers to focus on symptoms that patients care about most, which standard textbooks might overlook oftentimes. It builds immediate trust with research participants and the public, which also reduces the clinical gap between scientist and subject. It transforms data into human stories, which makes science advocacy more authentic and impactful for policymakers. And linked in the chat is a paper to build upon more what we were talking about. So thank you all.
I think for time, we're probably going to skip the next two snowball questions and go right into Q&A. So for the Q&A, please feel free to either unmute or type your answers in the chat, and I'll pass the mics to Sophie and Legna to facilitate the Q&A.
All right, sounds good. So far we already have a couple questions for you, Doctor. One of the questions is, my question is, so far, what challenges have researchers studying OCD faced in the aspect of drug development?
Thank you so much for this question. Also, your comments are so kind about my story, and I really appreciate you being here, Faith. There's I'm going to just try to sum this up because I could just talk about this one question forever, but forget the lack of funding, the lack of support for people to do this work to be able to move forward the field. Purely and simply, that lack of funding and research has has stalled OCD or limited our ability to understand the pathophysiology of like the what is going on in the brain of people with OCD. And we need to know that to develop drugs. And so we like fun fact, really sad fun fact, there's never been a single drug approved that has been developed specifically for OCD. All the drugs we currently use are like used for or developed for other conditions. We're just like, let's just slap it on an OCD and times the dosage by 3 and call it a day. Like for serotonin reuptake inhibitors and things like that. So honestly, we just need to understand what's going on in the brain of people with OCD, and then we can develop drugs to target exactly that, because that part isn't so hard. It's figuring out what to develop drugs for. I guess one more thing is I kind of touched on it a little bit, and maybe because it just relates to this question we just talked about, like it's also difficult to develop drugs and take it through the pipeline if we're not able to really model the condition with a high level of fidelity in other or at least model the symptoms. We're never modeling OCD in an animal. We can never say like this animal has OCD or whatever. If you ever hear anyone saying that, that's inaccurate. But modeling obsession like behavior, compulsive like behavior in animals, that's where we start to develop to see if any drug is worth testing in humans, because there's so much risk in doing so. But imagine how difficult that is if we don't even have good behavioral tests and models for animals to like assess if something is like compulsive like to then go look at it in humans. Like I said, like we've been looking at very strange behavioral patterns that like are very, very loosely related to OCD, but a repetitive behavior is not a compulsion, right? So that's also why, again, taking animal models, taking lived experience, bringing that all together, if we can improve how we model in these organisms, we can then test drugs and have a higher likelihood that those drugs can move on into people.
Yeah, absolutely. Sai, you had a raised hand?
Yes, Dr. Uma, I just wanted to thank you for taking your time today and joining us and giving your insights in OCD and inspiring us and motivating us to continue this research. It really means a lot as someone who's going to be studying the neuroscience of psychology and diseases as such and interests. So my particular question was, I was going to ask if OCD can cause multiple other diseases, and if we talk about like the pathways, like cortisol or the different neurotransmitter pathways that you were mentioning, which get affected as a result of OCD, if they can have an effect in other diseases such as autism or PTSD, and causing them, like co-expressing them and causing them at the same time, and if those are being like studied and expressed. And also wanted to ask if AI and how the use of AI is shaping your study these days.
That first question alone, oh my gosh, it's hard for me to make my answer short. I'll try. My last name's Chatterjee. It's very hard. Okay. So to some, okay. So first of all, there's comorbid conditions, co-occurring conditions, right? Like there's the DSM plus like all the other conditions in the brain that like people can have at the same time as OCD. And it's just so important to underscore, period, to anyone listening, that like the brain, we're not born with like the OCD brain, the autistic brain, the, Parkinson's brain. Like we're born with a brain that has a bazillion different building blocks, and each little piece and level of it is developed in such a way. And ultimately it shapes how the brain functions and on every level. And then that leads to different dysfunctions that can lead to different disorders or different symptoms and different symptom clusters that we then, label as disorders. And that's the best we can do right now. That's what the DSM is built on, because we don't yet have the technology to like image and look at and just like discreetly with biomarkers diagnose a condition for what it is. So that being said, like I have so many conditions co-occurring with OCD, and it's almost like, what is that, right? And so many of the conditions you listed, Sai, I have. And so to answer the question of does OCD cause those, we don't really know like what causes anything, to be honest with you. However, the closest answer I could say is OCD, largely compared to other neuropsychiatric conditions, is more being conceptualized as a neurodevelopmental condition, like things like OCD or things like ADHD and autism, in the sense that it develops really early on in people. It's, these are all brain disorders, but it's like a brain motor system dysfunction that has psychiatric, like mental illness consequences almost in a sense. And so with that, there's, for example, lots of people that have OCD and depression. And when you're getting something like deep brain stimulation surgery, like one would think, oh, do I get the depression like version or do I get the OCD version? And largely when people have multiple conditions, OCD and something else, they will go to the OCD version because it tends to help resolve all the other ones, because a lot of times the dysfunction of those other conditions like depression are sort of downstream of the same, like because there was such dysfunction across the board in that circuit. This is very, very rudimentary. But it lends itself to like that same traffic issue causes problems in this other road too offstream. And so like basically I'm not saying cause, I'm saying maybe like the underlying root of if you can biologically intervene in this one condition, it could help so many others. But, also OCD is so highly comorbid with autism and ADHD and other things. And like, we just don't know. We don't know, but huge chance. And in terms of AI, I work with animals, like I work with cells, I work with human postmortem tissue. So like I would love to get more comfortable with like the computational side of things to be able to screen more targets, but also let, the computer people do that and just tell me what to do in the lab. But I will say AI sucks at like being accurate about anything. And like I've watched some senior researchers, they Google something, the AI gives like the wrong answer. And so just like read papers, guys, read papers and take classes. And AI can help like be an assistant to you to like do some work for you, but like not for information, at least in my experience.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, Uma. I think we're going to cut off the Q&A here, but linked in the chat are some of her socials, so feel free to reach out if we didn't get a chance to answer your question today. And just some final remarks, a recording of the session will be uploaded to the YouTube channel, and if you're interested in attending future Synapse sessions, please subscribe to the newsletter, as well as if you're interested in becoming a guest speaker, there's an interest form, and there's also an opportunity to earn a certificate. So Sophie just linked those in the chat. And I'll pass off to Uma to give us some final remarks.
I just want everyone to know, first and foremost, that I imagine there are people in the audience who are watching who either want to do this type of work or are doing this type of work and also live with mental illness or any other form of disability and feel like they don't belong, like they've been told that there's shame in being open about your condition. And that's true in the sense that like our field still has so much stigma and so much discrimination. And it's, I am one of the only people I know that is this open about my own story and my own continued survivorship. And that's a failure of the field. And I want you to hear from me that every single one of you is more than capable and more than worthy of doing this work. I just got done ranting about why your lived experience can be something that makes your work even better and makes a difference in your work. We need people like you. And I just want you to know that you belong, you deserve to be here. And don't let anyone, no matter how senior they are, tell you that you don't. I think there's a paper that linked in the chat that we authored and I first authored, we put out last year on researchers with lived experience of mental illness. Please read that and just know that you're not alone and reach out to me or anyone else anytime. And just also like, please support OCD and mental health research for anyone listening who's not a scientist, because that is the way we're going to be able to support anyone like myself living with this condition. And also thank you again to everyone for attending, and thank you to this amazing team for putting this together. It was such a joy to get to hang out with you all. And I tried really hard not to cuss. I hope I didn't. Oh, and I guess you can connect with me and on all the links below. My podcast is A Chat with Uma. It's a science communication advocacy podcast. I share my story. I have the top researchers across mental illness and otherwise sharing their work, and it's very accessible. So would love to have you there. I'm on social media everywhere at Uma Chatterjee. Please reach out anytime. I share my work there very liberally. And yeah, I'll hand it back to the team.
Oh no, Legna, I think you're muted.
Hello? Can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. That was so embarrassing. Anyways, hi. I just wanted to say thank you guys so much. In order to improve future Synapse sessions, we obviously would greatly appreciate it if you guys could provide some anonymous, valued feedback. We provided the link down below. Thanks to our lovely intern, Sophie. And thank you guys just in general for taking the time to come join us in the July Synapse session. Thank you so much for Dr. Uma Chatterjee. You are truly amazing, very inspirational, truly such a great session. And I definitely think that we truly appreciate your guys' engagement as well as your active participation. I think that, definitely with future sessions, it'll be like so much better to have like learned something amazing, especially like on the topic of OCD and stigma, as well as neuroscience in general. And I think that, thank you guys so much for coming by, and
Thank you all.